Alright, we are getting almost to the final of this course. Before everything, I'm gonna check my settings for the rigid body world. Speed 1.6, substats 4, just because I have restarted Blender from yesterday. Everything working correctly. Don't worry for the fact that all the doors are already opened when we are just traveling. We're gonna fix it just at the end. It's gonna be very easy, by the way. So in this part, we're gonna think about all of these additional small parts, like the muffler, the mirrors, the dampers, and this is gonna be very easy because they are not going to be deformable, and I wanted to work on all of them in just one single process, so we're not going to work on them one by one, so that this part is going to be quite fast and quite easy. One particular thing about just for a couple of these objects like the dampers, we're going to need to make some specific things because I want a particular behavior that is going to be different from all the other small parts maybe. So before starting, just expand the outliner, and in the RBC Aaron collection I am going to find my vehicle body RB object, this one here, and in the right I'm gonna activate this icon for the selectability. I think it turns off automatically when I restart Blender, by the way. Another thing I wanted to do that later we're gonna need it, I am gonna take note of the name of the rigid body of the central part of the bumper. So this rigid body here, that is for the central fractured part of the bumper, let's see, bumper 2. You know what, I'm gonna use the annotation tool and I'm gonna write it here, bumper 2 RB, of course. Later we're gonna need this information, and I'm writing this here because I just don't want to go back from some isolation in the middle of the work. So let's hide the ground first of all, because I want to see all the bottom parts of the car. So RBC ground, I'm gonna turn off this icon just temporarily. Now, so speaking about the two dampers in the front, that are these two objects, alright? They're gonna have some different characteristics. So basically I want this tire to jump away from the car during the accident, and so we are gonna need a rigid body for this damper, because this is gonna collide with the floor, preventing the car from going too much low. And instead for this other damper, which is the right damper, the right front damper I mean, this basically is never gonna interact with the floor, so we don't really need a rigid body for this part. So first of all I'm gonna simply select the right damper in the front, and let's look in the wireframe mode so we can see that you're doing correctly. So there is a very useful function in RBC Aaron, just selecting this damper. If I pull out RBC Aaron and with this damper selected, I'm gonna go under setup and activate the extra. You can see this plus button. So this is an extra object that will follow the rotation of the front right tire. So I'm gonna click on this plus button. And now this means that, look at this, if I start playing with the car, now this damper is following the rotation and the position of the front right tire. Nice, and this is already an object done. We can immediately move this object inside the collection of the Maserati. So when you don't find some objects with this object selected, just put the mouse here and press numpad canch or numpad period. And with this object selected, I'm going to move it in this collection, Maserati. So basically that's to remember to you, I'm moving all the objects that are finished, that are done in the Maserati collection. The parts collection is going to be useful just temporarily because I want to work on them in just one hit. Now I'm going to use a lot the collections. I'm going to make some additional collections because in this way we can speed up the process and make it very easy to work on multiple objects in just one click. So first of all, let's collapse all these collections that we have here so we can stay a little bit organized. Maybe I can leave just the parts collection opened. Alright, so just to work properly, I'm gonna now start creating 3 new collections by clicking on this button here, 1, 2 and 3, and just ensure that these 3 collections are not inside other collections. So just in case, drag them inside the scene collection, right? So this collection is going to be called rigid bodies small parts, and this second collection is going to be called constraints small parts. And instead this last collection is going to be called constraints lock. So I want to isolate the parts collection. So right click on the parts collection and click on select objects. And we have selected all these objects. So I'm going to isolate these objects now. Let's see what we have. I don't know why we have also the doors. We already have worked on the doors. So we can select these 2 doors and move them. So press M and move them to Maserati collection. They are still visible because we have isolated these objects, so we can remake the isolation. Just click outside to deselect, go out from the isolation and reselect the parts collection, select objects and isolate these objects. Cool. Now I'm gonna stay in the rigid bodies small parts collection. Speaking which, this collection is gonna be not visible to the render, so just click on this icon just in case. So with this collection selected, I'm gonna start by creating one single cube here, just in the side, far from this object. Also looking from the front, just put this cube down like this. It should not be disturbing any of these views. Alright, for this cube, basically I am gonna set all the settings that we usually use for any rigid body, so that we are gonna simply need to duplicate this cube many times and shrink wrap it to all these objects without having to tweak them manually one by one. So first, edit mode, select all faces and right click and subdivide just once like this. So we have a total amount of 26 vertices for this cube. Now I'm gonna go immediately under object properties, viewport display, activate in front and display as. I'm gonna choose wire and I am gonna immediately go in the constraints panel and give to this cube a child of constraint that is gonna be a child of the rig control. Let's see, rig control, there we go. And now finally this is connected to the rig of the car. Cool. I'm gonna go also in the modifiers tab, add the modifier. The first modifier that I want to add is a shrink wrap, and I am already giving a little bit of offset, and I can already tell you that it's gonna be 0.01, no more than this. For now, just leave the target empty, because we're gonna need to assign the targets one by one, by the way. After the shrink wrap, I'm gonna give also a decimate modifier so that we can reduce the geometry. We don't really need these 26 vertices for all these objects. Just in case, I'm gonna decrease the decimate to 0.4. Alright, and now staying on frame 0 is very important, otherwise we're gonna have some problems. Oh, my annotation has disappeared. Probably the annotation is related to the frame in which you are, so just remember, when we're gonna need this information, just go on frame, in the frame in which you have written this information, so in my case is frame 1. So now I'm gonna stay on frame 0, and the last thing that I want to do with this cube is go to the physics properties and activate rigid body. A mass of 1 is gonna be alright, damping translation, damping rotation, all on 0.01 as always. So let's do this. Starting from the top, I'm gonna take this cube and Shift D to duplicate it, and just give one copy of this cube for every one of these parts that you have in this small parts collection. Shift D, one for the damper that we got here, one for also for the targa, scale it down a little bit. Don't worry too much, just to cover this object entirely. Shift D, I'm gonna cover the muffler like this, and Shift D again to cover this kind of stick that I have in the back. Alright, and also looking from the side at this point, I'm gonna move all these rigid bodies a little bit up, except this one. Now it's actually convenient to move this all the way down here, so that it's not gonna disturb me anymore. So all of these cubes, I'm gonna move them up until they are aligned with the relative object. They should cover, by the way, so just ensure that it's covering very good. All of this I'm gonna be up like this. Alright, at this point, before proceeding, it's convenient to rename all these cubes that we have created. So select them, and to rename multiple objects in Blender, just press Ctrl F2. We have the batch rename function that we can use. Just set the type on set name, and as a method I'm gonna choose new name. The new name is gonna be RB small parts. Easy like that. I'm gonna press enter. There we go. So we have all this name assigned. Now we can finally delete the original cube that we have here. So first of all, now it's gonna be very easy to work in all of them in just one click. So select just one of these cubes, and then from now on, whenever you want to select all the objects that stay in the same collection of the selected object, I'm gonna simply press Shift G so that we can choose select grouped collection. Right? And we also have to ensure to select the right collection. So don't choose the rigid body world, but the right collection. In this case is rigid body small parts. There we go. So from now on, this is going to be very useful. Now, let's start to assign all the parts. So for example, this one in the modifiers options in the shrink wrap, as a target, I'm going to take this pick tool and simply choose the object that I want to shrink wrap. There we go. Also do the same for this cube. So target is going to be the damper. Do the same for all the other objects. Basically, this is going to be the mirror. This is going to be the one for the muffler. Target, the muffler, and this is going to be the one for this stick that we have in the back. There we go. This is gonna be the one for the other mirror. There we go. Once this is done, start applying all these modifiers one by one. So maybe let's stay in wireframe mode. So starting from the top with the mouse in this top modifier, not over this one. Over this one, Control A again. Okay, I'm gonna do the same for all these objects. Control A, very quickly, doesn't require so much time. So we are creating real geometries. Alright, easy like this. And now we got all the correct rigid bodies that we need. I'm gonna reselect these rigid bodies, Shift G, choose collection, rigid body small parts. So first thing to do is Control A, apply scale, Control A, apply rotation as always. I'm gonna have to go under object, set origin to the center of mass volume. And maybe we can enter in edit mode, in faces mode. And we can press A to select all the faces and press Shift N to eventually recalculate correctly all the normals. Finally, we can exit from edit mode and we are ready to go. As you can see, I have created multiple rigid bodies very easily. Alright, once we have created all these very simple rigid bodies, it's time to connect all of them correctly. So my idea is this: we're gonna connect them with the rigid body of the car just to have a one-click solution. And after that, we are gonna adjust a couple of them, for example, the mirrors that are gonna be connected instead to the doors. So let's do this. First, select one rigid bodies of this and then Shift G, collection. The right collection is rigid bodies, small parts. Now I need to select also the rigid body of the car, but even if it's invisible, don't worry, just find it in the outliner. And with all this selected, just hold the Control and select also the vehicle body RB. And of course, ensure that the selectability is activated, otherwise you are not really selecting it. So these are orange and this is kind of yellow. Now we can go back in the viewport, and with all these rigid bodies selected, I'm gonna go to simply object, rigid body, and connect. Pay attention. After clicking on this function, you have to click nothing, because we're gonna have to immediately do something that is gonna be in a pop-up menu that is gonna disappear once you click something else. So connect. This is gonna generate all the constraints that we need in just one click. You can see this pop-up menu in this left bottom corner. Just watch from the top what's going on, maybe in wireframe mode. So whenever you have just connected all these rigid bodies, in the pop-up menu here as a location, just change this from center to selected, because this is gonna put every constraint exactly where we have all the rigid bodies. You can see now they are correctly placed all around these rigid bodies. And finally, we can select these new constraints, and let's find these new constraints. They are here outside everything. I'm gonna put them in the collection called constraints small parts. This collection here. Nice. And now we can also rename them. So right click, select objects. All these constraints are selected, only these constraints. So immediately in the viewport, I'm gonna press Ctrl F2. I'm gonna choose type, set name, method, new name. And as a name, I'm gonna use constraints small parts. Easy like that. I'm gonna press enter, and finally we have our new constraints categorized that are gonna speed up our workflow. So still with this empties selected, I'm gonna go down here. Maybe we can shift and left click one of them so that we have one of them yellow, which means active. And with all these constraints selected, I'm gonna go down here and I'm gonna change the display as single arrow so that they are gonna be easily findable. You will see that we are not changing this for all of them, and that's because you have to hold Alt. Holding Alt, I'm gonna change it now again, display as single arrow, and this is gonna change this for all of them in just one click. We can also hold Alt and Shift and drag this size a little bit like this. And for now it's okay. We can even first save the project, just in case. We can press spacebar just to see what's going on right now. And you can see these parts, these rigid bodies are staying connected to the car. Now we can adjust a couple of them that don't really need to be attached to the car, but to other specific parts. Starting from the mirror, for example, let's stay in frame 0. So this mirror, as far as I remember, was attached to the door, not to the car. So in the physics properties, I'm gonna change this to target objects. The small parts RB is correct. Instead, the vehicle is not correct. So I'm gonna simply click on this X button and simply manually try to find the rigid body door. So it's gonna be door, right door, RB. I'm gonna do the same for this mirror here. So change this from vehicle to to, let's search the door rigid body, left door rigid body, there we go. Let's check twice, right door, left door, nice. And this targa, I want this targa to stay attached to the central part of the bumper. And that's why before I said to you to take that annotation. So let's go on frame 1 in which I had my annotation. So the name of the right part of the rigid body was bumper 2 RB. So let's go in the physics properties of this constraint. I'm going to change this from vehicle to bumper 2 RB. So not this one, because this is the original mesh, but the RB version. Nice. And other than that, all the other constraints should be fine. Let's see. We probably have a problem in this damper, because this is gonna, for sure, is gonna intersect the rigid body of the tire. And that's why when you play the animation like this, you can see this rigid body going crazy like this. So I'm gonna simply fix this problem by changing the collision layer of this rigid body, just for this rigid body. So with this rigid body of the damper selected in the physics properties, there is this option down here, collections. It should be named layers, by the way, because collection can be confused with this collection, but has nothing to do with this collection, by the way. The proper name for this should be collision layers. So I'm gonna change, by default the collision layer is 1. Instead I'm gonna change this to the layer 2. So that now if you play the animation, you should see that this doesn't go crazy anymore, because it's colliding only with all the rigid bodies that are in the layer 2. Speaking which, let's check immediately, because I want this rigid body to collide with the floor, and with the floor only. So in RBC Aeron, let's search the ground, RBC ground, let's see the collision layer for the ground. Collision, collision, there we go. You can see the ground is correctly set, colliding with the layer 1 and also with the layer 2. Fine. So this is fixed. Now all the parts are following as well. You can see the target following the rotation of the bumper. Another thing that I want to do is to make all these constraints a child of the rig control. So select one, Shift G, collection, constraint small parts. And with all this selected, I'm going to go in the constraints panel, add object constraint. I'm going to choose child of, and the target is going to be, I'm going to manually write rig control until it pops up. There we go, rig control. And with all this selected, click on this arrow and copy to select it, so that we are gonna copy this constraint to all of them. And now just to check that all of them has the constraint. Nice. We can also make all these constraints breakable. So Shift G and select them again. And maybe I'm gonna make breakable all of them except for this damper, because I want this damper to stay always attached to the car. It's gonna protect the car from the floor when the tire is gonna break apart from the car. By the way, for now, just let's set all of them in the physics properties, holding Alt, so that we are changing this function for all of them. Holding Alt, I am gonna activate the breakable option. And as a threshold, I don't know, I'm gonna put 40 for now, maybe. Maybe this is too much. Let's start low. I'm gonna start with 30. For now, I'm just gonna go on tweaking this threshold, and just at the end, I'm gonna turn off the breakable for the damper. You know what? I'm gonna simply select this one. Later, we're gonna make some tests and see what threshold works fine. In this case, they are just staying attached to the car, which is fine. So for the damper, I'm gonna turn off the breakable option instead. Other than that, let's see. We can start on frame 0. We can start to parent this object correctly. So this damper is going to be parented to the relative rigid body. Control P, set parent to object. This targa, pay attention, in the order with which you select stuff. So first select the mesh, and then holding Shift select also the rigid body. Control P, set parent to object. Also this one. Just to check twice that you are not parenting in a wrong way. This is parented to this one, and this is gonna be parented to this one, and the muffler is gonna be parented to this one. Control P, set parent to object. Nice. We can press space to play the animation. Let's see. You can see when you play the animation that everything looks correctly, and we probably are gonna have some problems back here, because we have two rigid bodies that are pushing each other. So we can fix this if we want. Maybe later we're gonna have some problems with this when the car is gonna start to drive. If you have some problems with rigid bodies intersecting like this, a cool way of fixing this problem is also to select the constraint and basically connect these rigid bodies together, so that the constraint is gonna disable the collisions between the two objects connected, which sometimes is more convenient than using collision layers like we did for the damper. But for the damper, it was necessary to isolate it in another collision layer. Instead, in this case, we simply need to, I'm gonna change the target of this constraint. So this constraint is gonna connect this small part that is the part 6, not to the vehicle body, but I'm gonna change this to pick tool. I'm gonna choose this rigid body of the muffler. And now play the animation and look at that. They are not colliding anymore each other, which is gonna prevent a lot of problems later. Nice. Now let's check twice that all these are breakable, except for the one of the damper, of course. Breakable, breakable, breakable. All right. So, by the way, you can add a bunch of additional objects in the bottom part so that you're gonna have a lot of stuff breaking apart together with the particles, but is something that I'm not gonna do it because I want to keep this simple. Let's proceed. As a last touch, of course, I want all of these constraints to be visible in front, so select all of them and holding Alt, I'm gonna activate the in front option. Cool. So you can see that we are working in a very organized way and we can finally make some tests going out from the isolation and start driving the car just to see what's going on right now. Let's see. At this point, you're going to have to tweak a little bit the strength of these constraints. For example, in this case, they are not really breaking apart from the car. So I'm going to want to lower the threshold. Let's see. I'm going to try to select them again. Constraint small parts, Shift G, collection, constraints small parts, threshold, and I hope I'm not going to change also the breakable option for the damper, but should not be. Actually, because this constraint of the damper is different from all the other of the small parts, I'm going to move this constraint in the collection of the main constraints, so this one here. There we go. So that finally, when I select all these constraints of the small parts, we are not selecting anymore the constraint of the damper. This is a cool way to work. Now it's up to you to test the strength of the constraints until you are happy. In this case, I made some tests and see that a strength of 10 is basically correct. Nice, everything is working correctly, and now it's finally time to actually, first of all, let's make the constraint of the tire breakable so that we are gonna lose one tire when there's gonna be the accident. So let's stay on frame 0 and I'm gonna try to find the constraint of this tire now, the front left tire. Let's see, RBC collection, where is this one here? So the tire that I'm looking for is the front left tire. You can see that we have a bunch of objects for every tire. This is the stuff for the front left tire, this is the stuff for the front right tire. So in the front left tire, which is this one, I'm searching for the constraint, there we go, this one, which is not selectable, so I'm gonna make it selectable. There we go, and maybe select it again. And simply in the physics properties of this constraint, I'm gonna make it breakable. Even if it's not visible, don't worry, it's gonna work. So breakable, and as a threshold, I'm gonna try with a threshold of 50. And now it's just a matter of making some tests, smashing your car all around the map just to see what works fine for you. This is too weak. A threshold of 200 is working fine. So there's one thing to say about the tire. It's breaking apart in a correct way whenever we have the accident. But remember to don't drive the car after the accident like this, because if you do so, you're gonna notice some weird behaviors from this tire. Even if the tire is detached from the car, it's gonna still follow the rotation that you give using the keyboard commands. Let's see if I can do it right now. I'm not able to replicate this problem, but it just happened to me and I noticed that it's like that. So just make the accident and then leave the keyboard and leave the car go wherever it wants to go. So I'm just gonna leave everything like this. And now let's make the lock constraints finally. Now, we need to keep these doors closed until the moment of the accident. So first of all, let's try to understand which parts need some lock constraints. I'm gonna call them lock constraints. So I would say that we need the lock constraint for the two doors, also for the three parts of the damper, and for the hood, and nothing more than that. Because all the other parts already have their own constraint, that is a fixed constraint, so they are not gonna rotate and just gonna break apart when there's gonna be the accident. So I'm gonna try to select now the constraint of the door. That should be this one. You know what? I don't want to accidentally select the wrong constraints. So I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna change how the constraint looks in different collections. So let's select all the constraints that we just created for the small parts. So all of these constraints that we just created for the small parts, just to don't select them accidentally, I'm gonna go in the empty properties here and holding Alt, I'm gonna choose display as. We can do them cubes. It's gonna be alright. Maybe make them a little bit smaller, like this, so that we are not gonna confuse them with other type of constraints. Alright, and now we can finally try to select the constraints of the door. It should be this one. Yes, in fact it has the angle of rotation, and also this constraint is correct. Pay attention for the constraints that you select now, because it's very important. Now I want to select also the constraint of the hood. That should be this one. Yes, in fact it has the angle of rotation, and also the 3 constraints of the bumper. These 3 constraints that I get in the front part. So holding shift, I'm selecting 1, 2 and 3. So, to easily make all the lock constraints with all these constraints selected, just save the project before, so that if you make some errors, maybe you can go back there. And first, duplicate this constraint, Shift D, and then press Escape to leave them exactly in place. When you have just duplicated this constraint, immediately put them in a separated collection. So just press M and move to the collection called Constraints Lock. And we can finally find them isolated in this collection, so that we can finally manage them with all this selected. I'm gonna go in the physics properties, and holding Alt, very important, I'm gonna change the type of constraint to fixed. There we go. And now they don't have anymore an angle of rotation. We can make them breakable. A threshold can be a threshold of, I don't know, I'm gonna try with a threshold of 50, always holding Alt when you change these values, of course. And also, just for having clear ideas of what the constraints are in the different collections, I'm gonna go in the empty properties here and change the display as, holding Alt, display as. I'm gonna choose a sphere this time, and maybe reduce the size a little bit, so that we can clearly see that all of these are the lock constraints. And we can even rename them with all this selected. Press Ctrl F2, type set name, method new, and the name is gonna be constraints locks. Nice. So now we should be able to keep all these parts together in place until the moment of the accident. Let's make some tests. Start the animation. For the doors is working. Instead, for the bumper, we have something to fix. You can see that you are probably potentially going to have the same problem that I'm having here. The bumper is not really keeping together. So what you can do when you see this type of problems is just to override the iteration. So with all these constraints selected, I'm going to also add the constraints of the bumper that are this one, and this one. With all these constraints selected, I'm gonna go in the physics properties all the way down under override iteration. Holding Alt, I'm gonna activate override iterations. And we can literally increase the iteration to something crazy like 500. And let's make some tests. If you play the animation, and you see that now everything is keeping together in place. Nothing is breaking apart, nothing is bouncing until my beloved accident. And this part is done. We are finally ready to jump in the final part of the course, which is breaking the glasses. At the end, I'm gonna explain to you how to manage properly the cache so that you can record your driving animation in order to put it in your movie. And finally, we are gonna be good to go.